recognizing and resisting active measures, disinformation, and subversion. 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14, we read, "Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what fellowship has righteousness with lawlessness? And what communion has light with darkness? And what accord has Christ with Belial? Or what part has a believer with an unbeliever? And what agreement has the temple of God with idols? For you are the temple of the living God. As God has said, I will dwell in them and walk among them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore, come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. Do not touch what is unclean, and I will receive you." This is the word of God. The Cheka was the term of terror in the Soviet Union. The Cheka was the first of the security police of the Soviet Union, later became the KGB, Committee for State Security, or for Homeland Security, depending how you translate it, of the Soviet Union. Initially, this organization of terror was named the Cheka, meaning Emergency Committee, and founded the 20th of December 1917 by the instructions of Vladimir Lenin of the Soviet Union. And as a key part of the Russian Revolution, or correctly speaking, the Bolshevik Revolution, I've had Russians rebuke me for calling it the Russian Revolution. They said it's the anti-Russian revolution. Russians were killed by the tens of millions. Don't call it the Russian Revolution. It's an insult to the victims. It was an anti-Russian revolution. And these mass murderers slaughtered over 66 million people in the Soviet Union. The Cheka was established by Felix Dzerzhinsky. The Cheka was tasked by the Soviet Politburo with arresting, torturing, and executing many tens of thousands of dissidents, although it kept growing. Deserters, reactionaries, counter-revolutionaries. Counter-revolutionary could be an evangelist or a pastor. A reactionary could be someone who says, I'm hungry, or we never starved under the Tsar, or something like that. That's a reactionary. And so the Cheka was the sword and shield of the Soviet Communist Party. And they literally turned machine guns on mobs protesting in the streets, like Vickers machine guns, pouring into crowds, hard bullets. Can you imagine? They're complaining about the American ICE agents in Minnesota. Well, the communists seem to be able to get away with massacring people like in Tiananmen Square by the thousands without the leftists having any objection. This is the Iron Felix, the chief of the Cheka, Felix Dzerzhinsky. And, of course, Joseph Stalin took over from Vladimir Lenin. Lenin was bad, Stalin was even worse. And here's Stalin with his friend Felix Dzerzhinsky. Felix Dzerzhinsky turned this into probably the most phenomenal, formidable secret police in history. In 1922, the Cheka was renamed the NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. Internal affairs, I mean, you may be thinking nature reserves, game parks, things like that. Well, for them, for internal affairs, it meant disemboweling people and locking up in dungeons. And here they are marching at a May Day in Red Square with their Hammond sickle and the symbol of the Cheka and Felix Dzerzhinsky. This is a statue of Iron Felix in St. Petersburg. And of course, the Cheka morphed into NKVD and later the KGB. Now, the NKVD included border guards and archives, and the NKVD was most notorious for running the Gulag, the forced labor camps. Has anyone here read the book, The Gulag Archipelago? Okay, well, Gulag was an acronym for Main Administration of Corrective Labor Camps. It's not a term that was invented by Alexander Solzhenitsyn when he wrote the book, The Gulag Archipelago. Gulag was the name of the main administration of corrective labor camps, but he popularized it in the public consciousness that the Gulag represented torture camps, death camps, where the people were working in Arctic hellholes of Siberia, where the temperatures could go down to unbelievable amounts, like minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit and things like that. Absolutely staggering. These poor people were frozen solid, undernourished. It was just disgusting. And this is a picture of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who became one of the most famous Russians of the 20th century because of his books, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, the Gulag Archipelago, the Cancer Ward. 4 of his books today are setback books required reading in Russian schools. The Gulag Archipelago is an absolute expose on what went on in these Arctic hellholes in the Soviet Union, which chewed up about 50 million people's lives. The Soviet forced labor camps. And it's like a whole lot of islands out there spread. These are just some of the concentration camps, many of which were nothing but death camps. And they were labor camps. They forced the people into the bellies of the earth to bring up the iron ore or coal or whatever it was that they were mining. Siberia's got a lot of great resources, and they used human labor to extract it. And these people were worked to death, starved to death, beaten up, murdered, butchered in terrible ways. Mass extrajudicial killings were done by the Cheka and the NKVD. They wiped out vast amounts of people. And Yagoda was the leader, but his successor, Nikolai Yezhov, presided over the Great Terror and the Purges, where they massacred vast amounts of the vanguard of the revolution. This is something that's kind of interesting. Every communist revolution, the second phase of the revolution is when they kill the first guard, the ones who did the revolution. If you've read the book Animal Farm, you know that Snowball, the hero of the revolution, is killed by the dogs of Napoleon, who wasn't actually involved in a revolution, but took over later. And Napoleon is a prototype for Stalin, and Snowball is a prototype for Trotsky. Trotsky was the hero of the revolution. Trotsky was the vanguard of the revolution. He was part of the Red Army that won the revolution. And then Napoleon's like Stalin, who came in later, hijacked the revolution and murdered everyone. So Yezhov is the mass murderer of Stalin. And this man, Vasily Lokin, is actually in the Guinness Book of Records. He killed more people than anyone else personally, not by orders. He physically shot 7,000 Polish officers, 20,000 people in total in the head. He was the executioner. And by the way, he normally preferred to use German pistols because they didn't jam. So he preferred a Luger to the Makarovs and the Toporovs of the Soviets. And he found them more accurate, they're more reliable. And also his idea was, if the bodies are found, you can blame it on the enemy. But there's very little pictures that exist, but there are a few. The NKVD purges of Ukrainians and Lithuanians murdering people. To show their callousness, they actually required the families to pay for the bullet that killed their relative before they released their bodies to them to be buried. Russia is filled with graves of victims of the Stalinists and Vladimir Lenin and these other Marxists. They've got a few museums and monuments where they'll put up some of the pictures of victims that they know, but it's not possible to get them all because so many of these people are just nameless victims. And the Katyn Forest Massacre is just one of the examples of where the Soviets murdered the entire intelligentsia, all the leadership of Poland. They shot in the head 26,000 Polish officers, NCOs, intellectuals, chaplains, military leaders. They're basically the entire leadership of Poland, and blamed it on the Germans. German officers were hung at Nuremberg for what the Soviets knew, everyone knew the Soviets had done. Whoever controls the past controls the future. Whoever controls the present controls the past. That's one of the statements of George Orwell in his 1984 book. In other words, if you control the present, you can rewrite the history. And you can blame your enemy for what you've done. NKVD and KGB were also famous for espionage. In fact, their espionage was much greater than all other countries combined. I've read the book, The Secret War by Max Hastings, which took more than 80 years after the Second World War to come out. It's a history of the Second World War from the perspective of the intelligence agencies. And as he points out, the Soviets spent more money on espionage than Britain, France, Germany, America, Japan combined. And you can throw Italy in as well. And so the Russians invested in espionage from the very beginning. And it wasn't just spying on own people and assassinating their dissidents like Trotsky, who literally got axed in Mexico City. Lots of political assassinations, they were masters of it. Now these are just some of their folks. They enforced Stalinist policy with communist movements in other countries, like in Romania or Italy. Wherever there was a communist party, the NKVD sent agents that they could enforce conformity to the Stalinist standards. And when they got hold of Eastern Europe, they controlled all the secret police in all of Eastern Europe, the satellite states. Whether you're talking about Albania, Bulgaria, Romania, the Stasi of East Germany, they were the ones running the show. The NKVD was officially responsible to protect state security through massive political repression, including kidnappings, murders, assassinations, locally and internationally. To think Trotsky could flee as far as Mexico City, it didn't stop him from assassination there. Those designated enemies of the people were sent to the Gulag camps. Hundreds of thousands were executed by the NKVD in these camps. But just look at the angles. Can you imagine pushing a wheelbarrow up this kind of incline? The weight, it's inhuman. The families of those designated enemies of the people, including their children, were automatically repressed, according to the NKVD, by Order 486. And the NKVD organized the show trials and the Great Purge of Order 447. Now, in the Great Purge, in the show trials, they would get people who had been heroes of the revolution, so-called, who'd been the forerunners, they'd been the Julius Malemas or whatever their movement was at the time. And they got them to stand up in court and say, I'm guilty of being a counter-revolutionary and a traitor to the country. I call on the court to execute death penalty on me, and long live Comrade Stalin. How do you get people to do that? Only in a communist country could you get people to call for the death penalty on themselves and to express undying solidarity with the Communist Party and the leader who's condemning you to death. They could do it because their families' lives are at stake. And so at the end of the Angolan War in 1990, after we had defeated the Cubans in Angola, the general in charge of the communist forces in Angola, the Cuban general, he was put on trial for treason because he lost to the fascist South African running dogs of the revolution, the racist South Africans and stuff like this. And this man stood up in court, pleaded guilty to deliberately losing the war, sabotaging the efforts of the Cuban forces in Angola, and called for the death penalty to be put on himself, and said, long live Fidel Castro and the Communist Party of Cuba. Now, you don't execute a victorious general, just for starters. I mean, it was a confession to the world that Cuba lost. I don't know if you heard in the Cape Town 2010 World Cup soccer, what was 2011? 2010. Yeah, during that World Cup soccer, the North Korean team lost. And the coach and manager of the team had to confess on national TV in North Korea that they had deliberately sabotaged their team's efforts to win, and then they were condemned to some gulag or something like this. Because the team couldn't have lost because another team was better, obviously. There had to have been some counter-revolutionary traitor who undermined the team. And they get people to make these confessions because they have family that they hope will be spared. And here's some of the orders that were signed by Stalin. The Great Terror was Stalin's purge in the 1930s. Now, interestingly, in the 1930s, Stalin got paranoid. And of course, communists are always paranoid because they assume others are as bad as they are. And they assume, if I'm willing to betray and stab others in the back, others must be willing to do it to me too. But to be fair, he was inclined or pushed towards this by the Abwehr. The head of the German intelligence, Admiral Canaris, cooked up a brilliant plan of deception where he leaked through double agents information to Soviets that a whole lot of Russian generals were actually working for the Germans. Now, he picked the best, the most competent, the most capable Russian generals that were left in the Red Army to feed the paranoia of Stalin. So Stalin ended up killing his whole top high command, which made Russia more vulnerable to when Operation Barbarossa attacked the Soviet Union, that all their best had been killed by their own people. So it's one of the most brilliant deception operations done in the military to get your enemy to kill your enemy. I mean, that's brilliant. And they are paranoid. I remember us doing something like this during our work in the 1980s, when we were fighting in Angola, there was a group in South Africa called the Conscription Campaign. I'll mention later how they were funded by the KGB, but that's something for a bit later. So we helped start a group called Veterans for Victory. One of my friends stood up in a press conference and said, confidentially, we have infiltrated the conscription campaign so well that we know what they can do before they know what they can do, which wasn't true at all. But they were such paranoid lunatics that anyone who showed flair and innovation was just purged from the conscription campaign. They destroyed themselves because they're paranoid and they believe the disinformation. It's so easy to get your enemy to destroy himself. Well, the Great Terror, Stalin purged his best people out of the party and out of the army and so on. Of course, the NKVD were heavily involved in the Holodomor, the hunger plague in Ukraine, where they killed millions and millions of Ukrainians by confiscating all their food at harvest and letting the people starve to death. I don't know how many here have seen that film on the Ukrainian Holodomor. We showed it here years ago. I must probably resurrect again. Well made by the Ukrainians on the Holodomor. I'm just trying to remember the title right now. At any rate, this volume continues Rogover's exhaustive study of the Great Purge begun in his book of 1937. And that's the Checkers badge. If you look in our glass cabinet display case here, you'll see I've got an actual up-to-date KGB badge, a real thing, which was captured in Angola. So it's a KGB more up-to-date badge, very similar to this. More than 2,000 upper-class Lithuanians were seized unexpectedly by the Russian NKVD in Lithuania when the Russians invaded in 1940. And massacres of Lithuanians carried out in June of 1941. And this never made the news headlines because Russia was Britain and America's ally in the Second World War. So who cared about Christians murdered in Lithuania, Latvia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Poland, because that's done by our allies. And that's just the typical thing of things that were just ignored by the history books because of the fact that it was done by Uncle Joe's people. But the Great Purge of Stalinist Russia, they buried the bodies of hundreds of thousands of these victims in mass graves like found at Smolensk and the Katyn Forest Massacre. And these are some of the NKVD troops in the Second World War. When we call them troops, if anyone's ever seen the film Enemy at the Gate, it depicts where the NKVD would set up machine gun posts behind the Russian army, and when they attacked anyone who turned around, they shot them. So your men had to rush forward. Many of the Russian army weren't even equipped with rifles. Like the protagonist in the Enemy of the Gate is not given any ammunition or weapon. He's got to pick it up from the first man who falls. So they go into an attack not even armed. And if they turn back, they're shot by their own people. So these are NKVD who are positioned behind any Soviet Red Army attack to make sure nobody turns around. And that's one of the reasons why the Russians are so formidable. Human wave attacks where they just kept coming. And why did they attack like that? Not because they're motivated, but because if they were more afraid of the NKVD behind them than the enemy in front of them. And in Lvov, which is in Ukraine, huge amounts of Christians killed, June 1941. Alexander Solzhenitsyn said the world has never before known a godlessness as organized, militarized, and tenaciously malevolent as that preached by Marxism. Within that philosophical system of Marx and Lenin, and at the heart of their psychology, hatred of God is the principal driving force, more fundamental than all their political and economic pretensions. This is more and more relevant today because you won't understand the woke nonsense going on in the world unless you understand their Marxist roots. They hate God. Therefore, they hate those made in the image of God. They hate the family. They hate anything to do with God and God's people. Militant atheism, Solzhenitsyn said, is not merely incidental or marginal to communist policy. It is not a side effect, but the central pivot. Here, a church in Berlin being blown up by the Soviets. To achieve its diabolical ends, communism needs to control a population devoid of religious and national feeling. This entails a destruction of faith and nationhood. Communists proclaim both of these objectives openly, and just as openly they put them into practice. you can see the attempts to destroy nations, to destroy borders, to destroy faith, to destroy churches, not just getting the Bible out of schools and getting prayer out of schools and 10 Commandments off the walls. They want to destroy the very identity of any country that was once Christian. Active measures was a Soviet term for the actions of political warfare conducted by Soviet security services, the Cheka, the NKVD, and the KGB, to influence the course of world events. Now, how many of you have heard the word active measures before and understood the concept? Is this a new concept to most? Active measures. In addition to collecting intelligence and producing politically correct assessments of intelligence, they were also to be involved in active measures. Can anyone read Russian? What does that say? Pravda, which means truth. The Russians had two newspapers, had Pravda, which means truth, and had Izvestia, which means news. And our Russian friends would say, there's nothing true in Pravda and there's nothing new in Izvestia. And if you don't read Russian, the translation of this propaganda post is, under the leadership of the great Stalin, forward to communism. And so this is the kind of mindless propaganda they keep producing. Even on the playing cards, they would have pictures of Stalin on the back of the playing cards. So you couldn't even play cards without having the propaganda on it. Can you imagine? Not that I play cards, but still. Here's the 23rd Communist Party Congress. Notice the idolatry, these massive statues of Lenin and the red banner and the Hammond sickle and all this rubbish. Here's the 70th anniversary of the KGB in the Soviet Union, 1987. And you can see the same badge of the KGB there that I've got in our cabinet's case, second from the front here. Active measures included media manipulations through disinformation, propaganda, counterfeiting official documents, infiltrating churches, intimidating dissidents, character assassinations, fines, imprisonments, and assassinations. They were involved in all those things, including destroying the reputations or character assassinations of Christian leaders, authors, and journalists. Active measures included the establishment and support of international front organizations like the World Peace Council, and setting up terrorist groups, and wars of national liberation in third world countries, which Cuba played a key role in. You can see Fidel Castro with, anyone recognize this person in the middle here? Yeah, the President of Angola, Agostinho Neto, that's right. Drunken, psychotic Marxist poet, to quote from the CIA documents on him. Infiltrating the World Council churches was another part of the active measures of the KGB. And that explains why we've got so many churches like we have today. Charles Spurgeon said, that very church which the world likes best is sure to be the church that God abhors. Now, I've been told recently that there's been a massive increase of Christian content on social media, even though we know there's massive amounts of censorship and throttling and shadow banning of Christian content on it. But statistically, we've got more Christian content on TikTok and so on than before. So how do you explain that? Well, communists don't bother to censor everything because some things are not a threat to them. If Christians are teaching, for example, health, wealth, prosperity, gospel, name it and claim it, gab it and grab it, and that sort of thing, why would a communist want to censor that? But those things that are a threat to them, they will throttle. The NKVD had as a high goal to infiltrate educational institutions. And you've noticed how many of them take in people who are free thinking and they end up being some kind of woke, brainwashed fool. The entertainment industry is full of Marxist garbage and trash. In fact, the KGB infiltrated Hollywood so early they said we were the only party in town, pun intended. They hijacked Hollywood right at the beginning because apparently Stalin said the cinemas must be like our churches. He said it's so important that we get into Hollywood early and that we make sure that communist ideals and anti-Christian ideals are brought into films. And they were very effective at hijacking Hollywood. And as you notice, quite a lot of people have had their brains removed by programming. It's not called programming by accident. And the news media so often has scurrilous hit pieces against people who study history and so on. And cultural Marxism, if you haven't heard of Antonio Gramsci, You should know of him. He was the head of the Communist Party of Italy. And Gramsci was part of the Frankfurt School of Marxism. And he said, Lenin got lucky. We will never again have that correlation of forces of the First World War and the ability to have brought down the Romanov dynasty in Russia and create a Bolshevik revolution. It was just a correlation of forces that made it possible for the people absolutely exhausted by defeats in the war, that they were willing to not put up any resistance as we took over. He said, but Western Europe is too Christian. We cannot seize the West until the West has been de-Christianized. So he came out with what he called the Gramsci strategy. And the Gramsci strategy is that you've got to get people in the West to no longer think in a Christian way, but to get them to think not just in a non-Christian way, but to turn them to anti-Christian. You've got to get them to look at every problem without consideration of God or the Bible, or Christ in particular. And so, I mean, just think of the Bill Cosby show. I mean, that's a classic. You've got a happy, intact family, no prayer, no Bible, no church, no religion. Everything is solved by just secular humanism. That's the kind of goal, to get people to think of things. And they said Fabianism, common purpose, multiculturalism, political correction, mass immigration. He said we must use the termite strategy, infiltrate education, entertainment, news media, religious institutions, political institutions, the 5 culture-carrying, culture-transforming areas of society, and rot out the insides of every pillar like termites. And they can keep putting coats of paint on, but one day the whole edifice is going to collapse. That's a Gramsci strategy. Another person in the Frankfurt School of Marxism said, Herbert Marcuse said we must use foul language as verbal grenades against the Christian bourgeois. You've got to introduce foul language and pornography into the arts and entertainment, into shows, into films, into public consciousness, and by introducing vulgar speech and crude art and debased music, we're going to rot away the insights of Western civilization. And by the way, when Hillary Clinton was asked who was her model, her mentor, she said Herbert Marcuse. And when Bill Clinton was asked who was an inspiration to him, he said Antonio Gramsci. So, I mean, they are products of cultural Marxism. And even Slime magazine came out with putting mass murdering dictators like this Khrushchev on the front cover of the Time magazine Man of the Year. And all kinds of class war music. Youth of a rising class discussing music and struggles that inspire and bring us together. If you wonder why some music sounds so obnoxious, much of it's designed to. Angry rock that's going to get you wanting to go and bash your neighbor, burn, smash windows, turn dustbins upside down, wreck things. And so class war music. Some of the music today is not music, it's just noise. But it's designed to appeal to the base emotions and get people riled up that they're willing to invade churches like in Minnesota, attack altars, and just cause murder and mayhem. Of course, behind the scenes are these cursed bankers, or should we call them banksters, like JP Morgan, the Rothschilds, and the Federal Reserve, and all these creeps. And the KGB General Oleg Kalugin described active measures as the heart and soul of Soviet intelligence. Anyone recognize this white man to the side of Nelson Mandela? Joe Slovo, KGB colonel, Nelson Mandela's handler. Slovo is a Lithuanian Marxist. He was the KGB's man in South Africa behind the scenes. And if anyone here has wasted their time watching the Mandela Long Walk to Freedom film, which I have, there's not one white man on the ANC side on the screen. To make it easy, all the white people are evil and all the black people are good, funny and nice. They have none of the white communists like Joe Slovo or Ronnie Kashrils in the background, even though he is a key part of the story. Because you don't want to confuse people, you know. White is bad, black is good, simple. I mean, just understand it. So they made the film so that it was just so clear that there were no white people on the communist side, on the ANC side. There were no black people on the government side. All the police were white. There were no black policemen in the Mandela Long Walk to Freedom film. Like there's no white ANC or communists. But that's just not true. It's never been black against white, it's been black and white together against red. Kalugin described active measures as subversion, active measures to weaken the West, to drive wedges in the Western community alliances of all sorts, particularly NATO, to sow discord amongst allies, to weaken the United States alliance to the people of Europe and Asia and Africa, Latin America, and thus to prepare the ground for revolution. And this they did with the help of the Andropov Institute. Andropov Institute of the KGB near Moscow taught active measures in a system of special courses. Yuri Andropov was KGB head, but at one point he became chairman of the Soviet Union too. And Yuri Andropov was a master of active measures. Well, one of his top men was Yuri Modin, who was the controller of the Cambridge Five. Notice the hand up there, because in intelligence terms, the man who controls you is your handler. So he's the hand. And his hand has got the Hammond sickle. And notice the names: Burgers, McLean, Philby, Blunt, Cairncross. These are famous as the Cambridge Five. They were Cambridge graduate, elite British people, recruited into the British intelligence community. They were sort of the 007 types of their time, but they're all working for the Soviets. Some of the famous active measures conducted by the KGB that are now documented by declassified archives include stirring up racial tensions in the United States by staging incidents. Now, the easiest thing to do is to infiltrate a group where the people wear masks and hoods. So the Ku Klux Klan, which was at one point a fairly innocuous group where they did very symbolic things, they got infiltrated by the KGB to cause racial incidents, to murder people, to stir up racial strife. And that was easy because they wore masks. I mean, how easy is it to infiltrate a group where you wear masks? They placed explosive packages in Negro sections of the American population under the Operation Pandora's Box, and they stirred up racial tensions in America by doing murders, apparently in the name of the Ku Klux Klan, although it was the KGB. They fabricated the story that AIDS virus was manufactured by American scientists in laboratories and, stir up hatred, all these sort of ideas. And these are just some of the KGB officers in training. Well, one Soviet department, the GRU alone, spent more than $1 billion to fund the peace movements in America to protest the Vietnam War. So any organization needs money, fuel, air tickets, hiring of halls, posters, printing, leaflets, all these things. And imagine $1 billion to promote peace projects in the United States. And he said these movements were hugely successful campaigns, well worth the cost. They're worth more than 10 times that amount spent on arms and ammunition for the army. Stanislav Lunev claimed that GRU and the KGB helped to fund just about every anti-war movement, every pacifist organization in America, Great Britain, throughout Europe, and South Africa. And I know this because I infiltrated the South African end conscription campaign back in the 1980s. They were being run in Cape Town from just down the road here, from the Congregational Union Chapel just off Park Road. And I got into the place because I'd just been traveling around by motorbike in Mozambique, and anyone who went to communist Mozambique in the 70s and 80s was assumed to be a commie butty. So I was a young theological student, I'm on a motorbike and dressed with the kind of clothes that would make you look like you're part of the underclass of these youngsters who've got a bad attitude. And I just slipped in and I got all of their details and got to know how they work. These guys had no shortage of money, massive amounts of money. And it later came out, it was all coming from the Soviet Union, from the KGB. The KGB was even interested in funding our end conscription campaign in Cape Town. And we used to call it the Every Coward's Choice, ECC. According to Oleg Kalugin, Soviet intelligence was really unparalleled. A KGB program which could run all sorts of congresses, peace congresses, youth congresses, festivals, women's movements, trade union movements, campaigns against the US and Europe. There's so many groups, and I know quite a few of them in South Africa, they had no shortage of money, especially ones up at the University of Cape Town campus. And this is one of the publications of the Soviet League of the Militant Godless, Storming the Heavens. And they were actually designed to mobilize the youngsters to go and attack churches, destroy everything Christian, burn Bibles and so on. Allegations that AIDS was invented by the CIA, all kinds of forgeries and fake material were targeted at politicians, at the academic community and at the public at large, which included honey traps where they would find the right kind of person that could seduce this man who's making a stand against communism or who's very outspoken on this and that, and to destroy their reputation. They called them honeypots, where they would get someone who could, and of course if they knew that this person was more homosexually inclined, they'd find the right kind of male to seduce them. And they did all sorts of tricks like this. I think they were called the sparrows. The KGB was involved in undermining and installing whole governments. Hungary, Czechoslovakia, any countries that caused a problem, they just topple the governments like that. And here in Berlin, at the Brandenburg Gate, about to set up the Berlin Wall. And these are the VOPOs, Volkspolizei. The KGB played a key role in installing puppet communist regimes throughout the whole of Eastern Europe. Although the people on the ground were not always so happy. This is some people in Prague, in Czechoslovakia, telling the Russians in their tanks that were invading them in 1968 where to go. The People's Republic of China was also a creation of the Soviet NKVD operations. Doesn't that look like freedom to you? That's what the peasants get, a bullet in the back. Of course, the North Korea, Afghanistan, these are also operations by the NKVD. The KGB coordinated mass political repressions, the establishment of subordinate secret services in all occupied territories, like the Stasi in East Germany and the Securitate in Romania. Now, when I first started going to Mozambique, I wondered how it was I was getting away with so much. I mean, I'm smuggling in Bibles, I'm showing Christian films in churches with Jesus film, 16mm projects and so on, and nobody's bothering me. And I said to one of my hosts, you know, it's obvious I'm not from around here. Why are they leaving me alone? They said, yes, you don't look Portuguese, so they assume you must be Stasi. You look like you're an East German. The Stasi run the secret police here in Mozambique. And so that was kind of nice, to be mistaken for a Stasi agent, I guess. And I got away with a lot in Mozambique. The last attempted coup organized by the KGB was the uprising against Boris Yeltsin during the Russian constitutional crisis in 1993, when they were removing Gorbachev and taking down the red flag of the Soviet Union and putting up the white, blue, and red flag of Russia. And so this led to Yeltsin abolishing the KGB and replacing it with the Federal Security Service and the Foreign Intelligence Service. And so the KGB is now extinct since 1993, officially. One of the tactics used by the KGB was agent provocateurs, inciting agents. And obviously an agent provocateur is an undercover agent who acts to entice another person to commit an illegal act or a rash act, or falsely implicates others in taking part in a legal act. And there's all kinds of examples. In America, they love to put up their old Confederate flags and so on, and associate themselves with the Ku Klux Klan while they promote communist revolution. The aim is to discredit, to harm another group by provoking them to commit a crime, or to implicate them in a crime to undermine the whole group or the whole protest or movement. So, for example, the most classic agent provocateur action was January 6th, the January 6th insurrection, as they called it, which was a protest where there were hundreds of FBI agents, hundreds of CIA agents in there inciting people. In fact, people even saying, as somebody is enticing them to go in and break this and break that window and so on, and folks would be shouting, Fed, Fed, Fed. And everyone knew federal agents amongst them. When they got to Congress and they were investigating, there were questions asked of the head of the FBI, how many FBI agents or assets were in Washington, D.C. on the 6th of January? And the man refused to answer. And they plainly are guilty as hell. This whole January 6th was a day when the government staged a riot to cover up the fact that they had just certified a fraudulent election. The 2020 election was about as fraudulent as the $3 note. And there's been so much evidence that's come out now. Then take the Waco, remember 1993, under Bill Clinton, they had this Waco massacre. So they said they thought the children were being abused, meaning some of the children were being spanked by their parents. So to solve the matter, they set fire to the whole compound, pumped in flammable gas, and then killed everybody. And You know, when the government says they care about your children, just remember that killing and burning them may be one of their solutions, as they did in Waco. So some kids were getting smacked, so the solution was besiege them, starve them, gas them, burn them, kill them all. And that was how the federal government under Bill Clinton solved the problem of some kids getting smacked by some crazy guy who believed we were in the end of the world and who didn't trust the government. Imagine, how can you be that stupid? He didn't trust the government. And then, on the anniversary of this 2 years later, at the headquarters of the ATF, who had done that massacre at Waco, they had a massive explosion. I remember this, the Oklahoma bombing? And many people killed, horrific, the worst domestic terrorist action in American history. Well, in 2001, the anthrax attacks in the United States turned out to be a total false flag, completely done by the US government themselves. All these anthrax bombings introduced, what they were doing is putting talcum powder in envelopes to make people panicked about anthrax. And it just enabled people to accept handing over more of their freedoms to the government because they were afraid. And so this is an active measures. Active measures are these kind of manipulative events that change history, accelerate legislation to going through. Home-based CIA-manufactured terrorism. Rand Paul, one of the more intelligent people in Congress, says, our founders never intended for Americans to trust their government. Our entire constitution was predicated on the notion that government is a necessary evil, to be restrained and minimized as much as possible. To quote from General George Washington, who is the founder of the United States of America, founder of the Republic of the United States, he said, government is not reason, it is force. Government is like a fire. A fire makes a dangerous servant and a fearful master. Now, a fire can help. If you want to heat your home, if you want to cook some food, a fire can be very helpful, but it's got to stay in the fireplace. If the fire gets out of the fireplace, you know that curtains are highly flammable. Carpets and furniture is highly flammable. By the way, hair is also highly flammable. Hairspray is even more flammable, by the way. But as some of our people have discovered, we had one of our field workers reading with a candle, and she had long hair, and woof, her hair just disappeared just like that. I mean, one go. And she was running around outside here, put it out, don't look. And she's, very nice or whatever. And so our people are trying to get their towels over and sit in the fire without looking. And anyway, this poor girl had her long hair on one side and nothing on the other side. But that's quite a popular hairstyle these days. Still, the thing is, fire is a dangerous servant. It's a fearful master. And governments cannot be trusted with power. Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so just think of the man-made lies about global warming. It's a total fraud. And you drive north of Pretoria, you get up to White Bridge, and they will charge you a climate tax. By giving money to the ZANU-PF government of Mnangagwa, is it Mnangagwa, the new dictator after Mugabe, the crocodile? You give money to the Zimbabwe government that's going to solve climate change. Isn't that an easy solution? But what a fraud to get lots of money out of. It's now admitted and documented. The Ukrainian officials admit Ukrainian snipers were firing on both sides of the riots in the 1940 coup d'etat in order to create maximum chaos. This led to the 2014 Ukrainian coup and civil war, which has led to this hideous war since 2022. But they literally, America put $6 billion into creating the political party of Zelensky. To fund this war, they bought up whole newspapers, radios, TV stations. And so America put $6 billion into changing the government in Ukraine, but that wasn't good enough. They still needed to kill people arbitrarily with sniper fire to create the panic and chaos that led to the change of government. That was done by that's active measures. 8th of April 2014, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter Seymour Hersh published an expose revealing that the Turkish government carried out the chemical weapons attacks which were blamed on the Syrian government. Although a member of NATO, Turkey provided the sarin chemical weapons, which Obama was able to use as an excuse for why we should bomb Syria and help the al-Qaeda terrorists there. President Obama attempted to use this pretext, this false flag, to launch America's full-scale war against Syria. I was in America at the time, and I had people saying, don't you agree we should be bombing Syria? And I said, no, can you find Syria on the map for me? And they couldn't, but the idea was, and these were conservative Christians at a Tea Party, which is a very right-wing group in America, and they wanted to bomb Syria because of the false flag, false reporting in newspapers. I didn't know much at that time, but I could guess this is a false flag at the time. The US government and the Turkish-backed rebels, not the Syrian government, carried out these chemical weapons attacks. And America planned to launch chemical weapons attack on Syria and blame it on Assad's regime. And Ron Paul at the time said false flag. He knew governments well enough to tell this where it's going. I don't know if you ever saw this picture in a Muslim newspaper. It was even being floating around here in South Africa. A boy sleeping with his parents, except it's just a photo. They're not graves at all. This is just a piece of emotive propaganda. Those are just pounds of sand, and there's no grave there at all. The war against Syria built on a lie. Now they've overthrown a stable government that allowed religious freedom for Christians. And you can think Israel can use phosphorus weapons, and that's not a problem, even though it's against the Geneva Convention, but America supplies them, so it's okay. The first victim of war is truth. So, we can send missiles into a country because they apparently used gas. Now, we can use phosphorus weapons, we can bomb the people, but somehow the one way you're not allowed to kill people is with gas. So, then you deserve anything. And here's these newspaper media all lined up to shoot the truth. And the CIA Director Pompeo admits he convinced Donald Trump over the chemical weapons attack in Syria to launch cruise missiles into Syria when it's been proven since those were own goals. It was done by Turkey, it was done by NATO. This was not something done by the Syrian government. And Obama invaded and bombed Syria and supported al-Qaeda specifically to remove the Assad government based on false flags that they knew. The Assad government was winning the war. Why would they use gas? Like, you can do almost anything. You can use phosphorus, you can use napalm on your own people, but you're just not allowed to use gas. And so the Assad government, which was a little bastion of religious freedom in the Middle East, has gotten taken down. Now, this is what it looked like before democracy. This is before liberation. Notice, democracy in America looks like this. You can't come anywhere near the presidential vehicle. But the dictatorship in Syria, the people could be crowding all around the president's vehicle. Before democracy in Syria, after democracy in Syria. And again, you can see Syria under the dictator Assad and Syria under the terrorists who today have put on a suit and tried to become more respectable. These are just some of the terrorists running Syria now. This is what Syria looks like now, and it's absolutely disgusting. And the churches in the middle, 6% of Syria were Christians before the overthrow of the stable secular government there. But let me show you an interesting picture here. This is not just ISIS taking down the cross of a church being burned out, Assad visiting the churches, many Christians in military uniform in the churches in Syria, because they knew under Assad they were safe. He allowed religious freedom, like Saddam Hussein in Iraq allowed religious freedom. There were 1.6 million Christians in Syria under Saddam Hussein. Today, there's not even 100,000 Christians left in Iraq. Iraq has decimated the Christians. It's been genocide there. Christians were supporting Assad's government because he was secular and he protected them from the Islamic extremists. And here in a church, people getting selfies with the dictator Assad. The fact is, he's a medical doctor, he's an intelligent man. If you've ever heard interviews with him, he knew what was going on, and he was protecting the Christians. Here's the heads of all the different religious denominations in Syria meeting with President Assad. And here another Christian congregation gathering around him without fear, and he obviously wasn't in fear of them either. Terrorism is like cancer, Assad said. When you deal with the consequences rather than the root cause, it'll only spread faster. We told the West it should not support terrorism and give it political cover. it'll affect all your countries and your people. They didn't listen to us. Just think of all these terrorists that they started. The US government started Al-Qaeda. Israeli Mossad started Hamas with the goal of exterminating the PLO, which it succeeded in. The PLO were Soviet-backed communist evil people. The PLO were doing the hideous things like the Munich massacre and so on. But the solution of, we're going to support one group of terrorists to get rid of the other group of terrorists. Well, it's like America supporting Osama bin Laden to fight the Russians in Afghanistan. That came back to bite them really bad. You don't support terrorists to beat terrorists. And this Ambassador Stevens, he took the first $500 million, here's the bagman, to Al-Qaeda. And he ended up getting killed in Benghazi in Libya. It's like you feed the crocodile, you're going to get eaten by him somewhere along the line. The West has destabilized Syria. Now you've got Syrian refugees all over Europe. I've met them as far as Belgium. And the Cataian Forest Massacre is just a classic example of the active measures of the NKVD. Our good friend produced this Agenda 2, Master of Deceit, which really documents how this Marxism works throughout the West now too. It's not just the KGB, the Soviet Union's gone, but the Marxists are continuing to work through our deep state, through our CIA, through the MI6 and so on. General George Patton in America said, politicians are the lowest form of life on earth. Liberal Democrats are the lowest form of politicians. And that's very accurate. And he said that back in 1945. In the trust operation, the Soviets set up fake anti-Bolshevik underground organizations in the 1920s, including a monarchist union of Central Russia, to control and neutralize the monarchists and other anti-Bolsheviks, other counter-revolutionaries. So they set up the opposition to themselves, knowing an opposition is going to be started, so let's set it up really so we can monitor who's going to join it. And by the way, that was done in South Africa too. I learned from General Groenewald in South Africa, head of military intelligence at the time, that the AWB, the Afrikaanse Weerstandsbeweging, was a deception operation of the National Party. They got a security police staff sergeant, Eugene de Branch, to set up the AWB that they could monitor the opposition to the National Party. The National Party was going to plan radical transformation, reforms. They knew there'd be opposition, so they set up the opposition so that they could monitor everyone who opposed the government. So the AWB had lots of funding, lots of banners, they were very visible. So anybody who opposed the National Party from the right could join the AWB so they could monitor them. And that's how, when they did start to do something, they all got arrested instantly, even though they were recce's and so on, and they're the Ace Akada, because it was being run by the security branch as a deception operation. The best way to defeat your opposition is set up yourself. The KGB used provocateurs to entrap and to discredit anti-communist groups overseas, which they described as reactionaries and counter-revolutionaries, most famously how they hijacked the Ku Klux Klan in America. And it's just so easy when the Ku Klux Klan works on anonymity to infiltrate anyone. After the Second World War, many NKVD agents were sent to join and penetrate independence movements and create puppet rebel forces amongst the Ukrainians, amongst the Lithuanians, Estonians. So they would set up their own groups or they'd infiltrate, and they even gave these men permission to attack Soviet authorities, to kill commissars, border guards, local police. Not a problem, because this would ingratiate themselves and prove their loyalty that they're truly anti-communist. Look, he shot the local commissar. But meanwhile, that was okay because the end justifies the means. And so they used this to gain credibility, and then they could exfiltrate senior NKVD agents to infiltrate the West, and they could neutralize and betray the real resistance movements and the real partisans. And remember, these guys don't lack funds, so they'll always have more money, more resources, and so these creeps can infiltrate very easily. The KGB General Alexander Sakharovsky declared, in today's world, where nuclear arms have made worldwide force obsolete, terrorism should become a main weapon. You see, the clash of armies like that in the Second World War, very destructive. You lose a lot of men, a lot of machinery, and it's extremely expensive. Tanks, aircraft, now missiles. But now, small groups of dedicated terrorists can do more damage. And you've got plausible deniability. And so the foot soldiers for the NKVD became like the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong. And Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And by the way, this Ian Mir Pacepa has been said to be the real model for Ian Fleming's James Bond. He doesn't look like it, but Ian Fleming's inspiration for the James Bond character. Now, this Ian Pacepa declared the KGB was the primary initiator of guerrillas worldwide. And General Sikorsky said, hijacking airplanes is my own invention. The KGB taught and trained the PLO and others to actually infiltrate and take over these planes. I don't know, but Sean Connery looked a lot better than this character. So in 1969 alone, 82 aircraft were hijacked worldwide by the KGB-financed PLO. PLO was one of the best financed terrorist groups in the world. And this is the Lebanon hijacking of TWA, you might recall. Even Swiss Air got kidnapped. And here at Pan Am aircraft wrecked. And here's a Palestinian boy darting amongst the wrecks of an aircraft blown up by the PFLP terrorists. And then you might recall Pan Am Flight 93 blown up when it was flying over Scotland and Lockerbie disaster. Well, the KGB established the PLO. The PLO was a KGB operation. Have you heard of the terrorist Leila Khalid? You should, because we've got the ANC trying to rename Santon Drive the Leila Khalid Drive because they want the American ambassador to have to write Leila Khalid on his address. And they want to have Leila Khalid on the American embassy's letterhead. And so this is just, she was the poster girl for the PLO terrorists. And this is the kind of thing the ANC thinks is a good idea. They've aggravated the United States on so many levels. The US hates the ANC for many reasons, and this is just one of them. The KGB started the National Liberation Army of Bolivia. Che Guevara is the face of the revolution. He's on how many t-shirts? Here's a quote: "Hatred is an element of the struggle, a relentless hatred of the enemy, transforming him into an effective, violent, selective, cold-blooded killing machine. A people without hatred cannot vanquish a brutal enemy." That quote you will see on some EFF banners. They've actually got that quote. In the Cuban Revolution, Che Guevara ran a slave labor camp and organized mass executions. Che Guevara was Fidel Castro's supreme prosecutor and his most efficient executioner. Under Che, the walls of the old fort in Havana resounded nightly with the fuselages of the firing squads. In just 3 years, over 4,000 executions, mostly by firing squads, were documented to have taken place under Che Guevara's orders. All these executions took place without any fair trials, without any due process. And Che admitted he ordered several thousand executions. He murdered women and children, and people wear his image on their t-shirts. Perhaps those who want to wear Che's image on the front of the t-shirt should put this quote on the back of their t-shirts. "Hatred is an element of the struggle, unbending hatred for the enemy, which pushes a human being beyond his natural limitations, make him an effective, violent, selective, cold-blooded killing machine." In honesty, they should have that quote on if they're going to have the picture of this creep. Also made Time magazine. "This is what our soldiers must become. Crazy with fury, I will stain my rifle red while slaughtering an enemy that falls in my hands. My nostrils dilate while savoring the acrid odor of gunpowder and blood. With the deaths of my enemies, I prepare my being for the sacred fight and join the triumphant proletariat in the bestial hell." This is the kind of expressions of a demon-possessed person. In fact, if Christ himself stood in my way, I, like Nietzsche, would not hesitate to squish him like a worm. Well, as it happens, Che Guevara got squished like a worm. And Jesus is doing just fine. If he thinks he could squish the Lord Jesus, he has no idea what he's talking about. Che Guevara is a thuggish Marxist atheist, and now he's on fire for Jesus. Karl Marx declared the first battlefield is the rewriting of history. And it would appear that anyone who's participated in the romanticizing and glamorizing of Marxist mass murderers like Che Guevara, they're not only advertising their own ignorance of history, but they're helping to reorganize reality, and they're promoting the undeserved hero worship of a communist killer. But this is what active measures means. And while Che Guevara was brave when he was murdering disarmed civilians, including a 14-year-old child in the La Cabana fortress, he was very cowardly when he was captured by the Bolivian army, and he groveled and begged with tears for his life before the Bolivians did to him what he had done to so many others. The National Liberation Army of Colombia was also founded by Che Guevara, and the KGB paid for them. And of course, that's part of what they've got in Colombia right now. And these are some of the Colombian army. And then KGB started the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which was started back in 1969. And the revolution marched all the way down to our shores of Mozambique and Zimbabwe. And the long reach of the communists, most people don't know the context of what was going on in the 70s and 80s, the Cold War. Some people call it the Third World War. That the Cold War was the Third World War. And of course, we had all kinds of dictators all over Africa being funded and aided by these scum. And like the Emperor Bokassa of Central African Empire. And the poor people on the ground, they just ended up tied to a tree or post and shot. So firing squad was the only freedom much of these people got. And that's why I was born and brought up amidst this flame of revolution going all over Southern Africa at that stage. And the Soviets were behind the whole lot. SWAPO was an operation of the KGB. It was one of their active measures. And you could see their weapons came from the Soviet Union or Red China. As you can see, the 82mm mortar, 60mm mortars, Chinese script, Soviet Cyrillic script. The car bombs going off like in Kalahari Sands in Windhoek, which I was there when it happened, heard the explosion, saw the aftermath afterwards. And our friend, Colonel Des Radmore, dashed in to check if there's any survivors, raced in immediately after the bomb blast, and evacuated any people he could find. He got the honoris crux for dismantling a Soviet bomb in Kaiserstrasse in Windhoek. ZANU-PF of Zimbabwe, an active measures operation of the KGB. And they murdered vast amounts of Zimbabwe civilians and Madabilis. Over 50,000 Madabili civilians were murdered by the North Korean trained 5th Brigade in Zimbabwe, another result of active measures. Those aren't bullet wounds, those are bayonet wounds from the Chinese pig sticker fold-out bayonets that they'd have with the SKS rifles. They cut the ears and lips off some Zimbabweans because they'd spoken against the communists and they hadn't listened to the commissar. This man's wife was forced to cook and eat his ears and lips. Missionaries, like at Elam Mission Station in Eastern Rhodesia, massacred, murdered. These are pacifist Pentecostal British missionaries. And nuns and priests and missionaries, civilian airliners shot down with Russian heat-seeking missiles, Strela missiles. And Joshua Nkomo bragged, we did it, our boys did, we brought down those aircraft. What he didn't admit to was that it was his men who cooked and ate the survivors as well. And we did with Russian missiles. That was a KGB operation. Robert Mugabe was one of their people. And probably the worst racist and the most hateful man we've had in Africa. The people who were invading the farms were probably also inspired by these very same folks. You can see the Comrade Mugabe president's slogans. These posters were not printed in somebody's home. These were organized by some active measures agency who would then hand them out. They come there to demonstration. You're given the caps, you're given the T-shirts, you're given the posters, the flags. It's all organized, it's all printed. This poor woman spoke against the communists, so they cut her lips off. Frelimo, another one of the KGB's operations in Mozambique. And the MPLA in Angola, Marxist People's Liberation Army. And the ANC in South Africa, the evidence is all there, it's strong. They were funded from the beginning by the KGB, they were controlled by the KGB. And their big operations like the Church Street bombing, the ANC got the help from the Communist International. In fact, it was the IRA who did the actual bombing for them. It was in their name, the ANC took the credit, but the IRA did the bombing itself, and they were coordinated by the KGB. The KGB were controlling a Catholic terrorist group in Ireland, the IRA, a Marxist revolutionary group, a nationalist group in South Africa called the ANC. It was hideous. The Church Street bombing was so bad, you've got all these glass windows up the sides, and the glasses were coming down like guillotines, cutting people on the street. And after that, we had to laminate all the windows in these high rises. But it was just hideous, the damage done, just the glass alone. The Pan-African Congress in Southern Africa, they're just a puppet of the KGB as well. Do you see this man here with a gun? That is a Bulgarian agent attempting to assassinate John Paul II. And this is Mehmet Ali Akagra. Solidarity was a great threat to the communists in Poland. And so the Polish Pope had to go. Lech Walesa was the leader of Solidarity. Well, Solidarity challenged the communists there by organizing the workers to protest. And Mehmet Ali Agra shot Pope John Paul II in St. Peter's Square. This is back in 1981. And Pope John Paul met with him afterwards, prayed with him. Very gracious move. Well, the Pope survived. Solidarity thrived. The communists in Poland lost. It was one of the first of the dominoes falling of the Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe. Now, do you know that the founder of the United Nations was a Soviet agent? Under the military intelligence of the Soviet Union, the GRU, Olga Hiss, an American lawyer and State Department official, was recruited. He was the first General Secretary of the United Nations. And he, right from the beginning, he's working with Nelson Rockefeller, the Secretary of State of the United States. Olga Hiss was identified by Whittaker Chambers, a former Communist Party member, as a Soviet agent. And this is all well exposed in the book, A Fearful Master, a look at the United Nations by G. Edward Griffith, which I read long ago, a very good expose of the UN. The UN was from the very beginning set up by the communists. Olga Hiss was prosecuted for perjury. He was a Communist Party member, he was a Soviet agent, and Whittaker Chambers is the one who blew the whistle on him. Major events in American history. There were hundreds of Soviet agents in the United States at the end of the Second World War. Do you know, during the whole of the Second World War, by order of Franklin Delano Roosevelt of America and Winston Churchill of Britain, neither British nor American agents were allowed to do any espionage on the Soviet Union. They pulled all agents out, and the Soviets had hundreds of agents in Britain and America on all levels. But the Americans and the British were forbidden to do any espionage at all on the Soviet Union during the war years and immediately afterwards. And so Olga Hiss was just one example of a high-profile Soviet agent in the upper echelons of the US government. And Chambers also identified Lawrence Duggan, Michael Strait in the State Department, and Harry Dexter White in the Treasury Department. Harry Dexter White was right up there with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, very influential. And not only that, but they infiltrated the entire Manhattan Project, that's the atomic bomb project. There were piles of Soviet agents in the Manhattan Project who were supplying all the atomic secrets to the Soviet Union. Now, to give you an example of just how serious active measures can be, to show the discipline, how many here have heard of the Profumo scandal? Okay, Profumo scandal brought down Harold Macmillan's conservative governments in Great Britain. It brought the Labour Party to power in 1964 general election. It was a masterful example of KGB active measures. It included entrapment, propaganda, and assassination. Now, John Profumo was Secretary of State for War in Britain, and he was the kind of intelligent, capable person that was said to be a Conservative Party leader and later Prime Minister of Britain. He was on the up. And he is married to a beautiful actress, Valerie Hobson, and this is back in 1949 when he became Secretary of War. Now, he is involved for a short time with an affair with Christine Keeler, a 19-year-old model, who just happened to be good friends with an MI6 agent, Stephen Ward, who was the kind of person who's doing a Jeffrey Epstein sort of thing, except he is providing women to the different attachés and military people and getting secrets and making sure he could compromise people. Well, Christine Keeler was also the girlfriend of Captain Ivanov, the Soviet naval attaché in the embassy in London. and part of Soviet military intelligence, of course. Well, incredibly, now, this affair ended in 1962, but the media didn't release the report then because the election was the next year. People have a short memory. So the KGB active measures timed the publication of this scandal. Think of it that they can not only control the media, but they can withhold the media from going with a scandal like this, because timing was key. They timed the publication of the scandal for 1963, just before the general elections. And it resulted in disgrace, Profumo resigning, and the Conservative Party losing the next elections. The Conservative Party was disgraced by this public scandal, and the way was made clear for Hugh Todd Gateskill, the leader of the Labour Party, to become the next Prime Minister of Great Britain. But Gateskill was just a liberal. He wasn't a hardcore communist. He was what they called a useful idiot. So then Gateskill gets invited to visit the Soviet Union, but he's got to come to the Russian embassy to get his passport and his visa. No, he can't send a secretary. He's got to come himself. That's very unusual. So at age 56, he goes to the Russian embassy. They give, sorry, there's a delay. They give him some tea and biscuits. He dies of a rare liver disease a few days later. So the ways open up for Harold Wilson to exploit and seize control of the Labour Party, and he became the next Prime Minister of Great Britain. Peter Wright, in his 1987 book, Spycatcher, and the Soviet defector Anton Golitsyn, who wrote New Lies for Old, they claimed Gateskill was assassinated by the KGB in order to place their agent of influence, Harold Wilson, who is codenamed Oldman, into the key position of Prime Minister of Great Britain at that critical time. And Anton Golitsyn is probably one of the most influential defectors ever. And Oleg Penkovsky also helped Peter Wright with his revisionist history on Spycatcher, which was banned in Britain, by the way, because it was just too embarrassing. It had to be published in Australia. And Peter Wright had to move to Australia. But notice, it's a Soviet key controlling Britain and America. Spycatcher really came out to, it's a big shock because it came out to so many details, including, you know, the James Bond films? M, the man who gave James Bond his instructions, do you know he's a KGB agent too? Sir Roger Hollis. Sort of ruined some of those films when you think of it. Wilson oversaw the disastrous betrayal of Rhodesia and other key aspects of the British Commonwealth and the implosion of the British economy and the escalation of war in Northern Ireland. Do you know that Harold Wilson sent the British Parachute Regiment to Northern Ireland, to Londonderry? Now, a friend of mine was in the Paras then, and he said they weren't given any riot training, they weren't given any civil unrest training. All the Paras were trained to do is kill people. That's all they were trained to do. They go in there, they don't have helmets, they've got their red berets, they're normal uniforms, they've got no shields, no body armor. So they go into Londonderry, they're told to line the road, and up comes this column of IRA protesters, led by priests and mothers pushing prams. And then as they approached the British Paras, the whole group moved to the side, and there was an avenue straight down, an aisle straight down the crowd. An IRA gunman lying on the ground opened fire on the Paras, and then the whole crowd closed up again. So what the Paras do, they just open fire. I mean, that's what they're trained to do. They came under fire, they opened fire, lots of civilians killed, which is exactly what the IRA wanted. This is active measures. And Harold Wilson put paratroopers in the middle of Londonderry, a Catholic area in Northern Ireland, to be set up for this, what they call Bloody Sunday. I mean, this man was evil, evil, evil. And he lied to Ian Smith so much. Ian Smith should have gotten independence. Rhodesia was the only self-governing British possession in the whole of Africa. Britain had never put a pound or a penny into Rhodesia. They'd never sent a soldier there. Rhodesia was self-governing, self-protecting from its first day. It was a model government and highest levels of education, all that in the continent. They would hand over Nyasaland, Malawi, to Banda. They would hand over northern Rhodesia, Zambia, to Kenneth Kaunda, but they wouldn't let southern Rhodesia rule themselves. And it was just double standards of the Brits, but he caused a problem which led to the war and the falling down of Rhodesia. So Harold Wilson was a swear word when I was growing up. And to work out that he is actually a Soviet agent from the beginning. And the Soviet agents who infiltrated British intelligence during the Second World War were some of the biggest names they had. Anthony Blunt, Donald Maclean, Guy Burgess, Kim Philby. And these were all Soviet people. Guy Burgess was also homosexual, by the way. And Anthony Blunt was the Queen's decorator and advisor when it came to everything to do with art. And he was a Soviet agent. Michael Straight, another one. And John Cairncross. Kim Philby was probably the most dangerous of them all. He probably oversaw the assassination of the Polish leader in exile, General Sikorski at Gibraltar, because he was station head at Gibraltar when the Polish head of state was murdered, General Sikorski. And here's Oleg Kalugin with Kim Philby. And Sir Roger Hollis, this is M. This is the man who gave James Bond his instructions. Sir Roger Hollis was the sixth man. He was he was also part of the Cambridge group, but was only exposed in a spy catcher for a book later. So Sir Roger Hollis, the head of MI6 who was giving instructions to the 007s, he was working for the Soviets. That sort of changes a whole lot of the scenarios, doesn't it, right there? They did incalculable damage to Great Britain and the free world. And they called the Cambridge Five, of which the Soviets are still very proud of, that they had some of the elite, best, highest placed British spies working for them. Now, it's unlikely that any other intelligence agency in history has been responsible for as many arrests, tortures, imprisonments, murders, massacres, assassinations, launching of foreign wars, sponsoring and training of foreign terrorist movements, toppling of governments, funding of so many revolutionary movements worldwide. The KGB is in a class of its own. It looks like the CIA is trying to catch up. The Black Book of Communism catalogues over 100 million deaths between 1970 and 1991, caused by communist governments, most of them controlled by the Soviet Union or its agents. This does not include Red China's death toll because we haven't yet got their files. They're not open yet. The Black Book of Communism documents communist states didn't merely commit criminal acts. They were criminal enterprises in their very essence. On principle, they ruled lawlessly by violence without any regard to human life. While they promised them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption. You could write 2 Peter 2, verse 19 across so many of these government agencies. But now, the Soviet Union is gone, but active measures is not, because the deep state includes communists in the West. How many of you have heard of Operation Northwoods? It was proposed, but President Kennedy turned it down. It proposed that the CIA organize genuine acts of terrorism in America to blame on Cuba, shooting down commercial airlines, bombings in American cities, phony evidence being placed, all kinds of false flags. So Operation Northwoods was seriously proposed and vetoed by John F. Kennedy, maybe another reason why they killed him. Right now, President Trump's trying to kill the deep state. But the deep state's still there, and I'm sure they were involved in the assassination of Charlie Kirk, for example. It was exposed last year how USAID was undermining Christian churches and freedoms all around the world, increasing persecution of churches worldwide, funding every vile activity. USAID was funding things that the KGB used to fund, and including Antifa and BLM and all kinds of marches, demos, right down to our what was it called? Roads Must Fall. Roads Must Fall down here was getting funding by USAID. And all the kind of nonsense, even in our country, even in our city, funded by USAID, who's doing the active measures that the KGB used to do. And of course, Hillary Clinton was a key part of that. The so-called Arab Spring, funded by USAID, active measures that the KGB would have been proud of. Destroying countries, toppling governments, killing Christians, destroying churches, initiating genocides of Christians like in Iraq. So today, it's like USAID and the CIA are doing what the KGB used to do, although USAID is being abolished, and not a moment too soon either. They overthrew this Mubarak in Egypt, who had the soldiers protecting churches in Egypt, and they replaced him with this Modli, who is a Muslim Brotherhood extremist, who had over 70 churches destroyed in one weekend. bombings of churches in Egypt, Christians murdered in Egypt. This is the kind of things USAID funded. So it's continuing to this day, these sort of things, like overthrowing of Syria. The CIA has been heavily involved with these things, getting ISIS and Al-Qaeda moving. There's a disgusting deep state still operating in the shadows. And you can see one of the symptoms of it is in Minnesota, millions, not millions, not hundreds of millions, billions of dollars stolen by Somali immigrants, many of them there illegally in Minnesota in particular. I've been in Minnesota and I've argued and debated in university with some of these Somalis, and they're radical. And you're talking about vast amounts in fraud, huge amounts of fraud going on, welfare programs, daycare centers that don't have any children, and these Somali fraudsters have been found to be very close to the governor of Minnesota, who's the vice presidential candidate with Kamala Harris. You know, Biden needed to find someone dumber than him. He found Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris had to find someone dumber than her, and she found this Tim Walz. And you can see this Ilhan Omar, Somali congresswoman. You can see the Democrats love these Somali fraudsters, and he's also an illegal alien, by the way. And the mayor of Minneapolis is also part of all of this support for the Somali fraud. They've got all kinds of bogus services built to the government to the tune of billions of dollars. And the way this Ilhan Omar put it, some people did something. How's that for generalization? 47 Somali Americans in Minnesota have been charged with stealing $250 million in COVID-19 federal grants. And these are just some of those convicted so far. It's not just America. In Britain, they've had grooming gangs, rape gangs, Asian rape gangs, where they had 1 million British children, boys and girls, abused, raped for decades. And the entire British Child Protection Services refused to do a thing. And all the British police stations refused to do anything. Scotland Yard refused to investigate. Why? They didn't want to be accused of being racist. Because the people doing the raping and grooming were Muslims and they were foreigners. And so as a result, what do you do? Well, they arrested Tommy Robinson, who was the whistleblower exposing it. They put him in prison instead of the scum who were doing the raping and the cowards who were covering it up. Well, now in Minnesota, you can see all these people, Walsh and Frey and the Attorney General Elson and Omar, they all have been part of this racket, and so now they all bring up the ICE agents as a distraction. So if you want to know what's behind it, this Jacob Frey, who's the mayor of Minneapolis, who's, by the way, a New Yorker, he's not a Minnesotan. What's he doing there as the mayor? Well, he doesn't care about Minnesota, but he's ordered the police not to respond to any requests for help from federal agents. So ICE agents have been under attack, under siege in their hotels, in their restaurants, and they can't get out, and they call 911, ask the police to come. There's a mob threatening them, and the police refuse to respond. And the Attorney General of Minnesota, Ellison, he has ordered the police don't get involved in helping federal agents. And the Lieutenant Governor, who claims she's an Indian, but anyway, she's in delusion as well. This Democrat has also ordered the police in their state not to help the federal agents. And the governor, Tim Walz, prime criminal of all, he's ordered them. How do you have a country like that where your police are not allowed to help federal agents who are being attacked by law-breaking thugs who are threatening to murder them, mind you? They've got crowds complaining, and I've heard them chanting, hang Kristi Noem, and kill an ICE agent, and so on. They're chanting these slogans in the streets. And so if you wonder why there's all this attention on ICE agents in Minnesota, it's smokescreen for these scandals that they've been caught out on. This is active measures, how to mobilize the street mobs, how to change the narrative, how to distract. And what is our response got to be? Stand up. Put on the whole armor of God. Be strong in the Lord and the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. Therefore take up the whole armor, that you may be able to withstand. Having done all, having girded your waist with truth, take up the shield of faith, the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Step out in faith. Fight the good fight of faith. Truth conquers. Win the victory. We've got to be overcomers. The world has got a lot of money. They've got a lot of active measures. They've got a lot of disinformation and deception, subversion. But greater is he who is in us than him who is in the world. Therefore, submit to God. Resist the devil. He will flee from you. Draw near to God. He will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. Not by might, nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him. He shall direct your path. Do not be wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord. Depart from evil. It'll be health to your flesh and strength to your bones. Awake, you who sleep. Arise from the dead, and Christ will give you light. Arise and call on your God.